All right, well, I'm Matthew Ismail. I'm the editor of Charleston Voices, and we describe Charleston Voices this way. Charleston Voices is a new Against the Grain online series that will offer diverse perspectives on key issues of interest to the information professions. Whether you're a librarian, a publisher, or a vendor, Charleston Voices will address the topics that matter most to your professional life. And as an entry in the Charleston Voices, Ashley Bailey and Doug Way contributed the impacts of automation on the future of monographic collection development. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, Ashley and Doug, please introduce yourselves and tell us about your Voices article.
Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ashley Bailey, Director of Collection Development and Workflow Solutions at GOBI. I work with university libraries in the central and southeast U.S. doing monograph acquisitions for print and ebooks.
I'm Doug Way, and I'm Associate University Librarian for Collections and Research Services at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Ashley and I worked on this article, and I think trying to bring perspectives on ways that libraries can work more efficiently with vendors and start to look at automation solutions to again, free up time to do other things is what I would say. So certainly within my library, we're asking more and more of our selectors. There's less time for them to do lots of different activities because we're asking them to do more activities. And so what are ways we can free them up? Certainly we think about things like reference or different ways of doing instruction, creation of learning objects and things like that. But I think collection development is one of those areas we can do that, where we can find ways to build collections really more efficiently. There's a lot of things that we buy in libraries that we could just really, doesn't really take a lot of intervention, a lot of activities, and I think vendors can really help us with that. So I tried to lay out a few different areas where I thought those opportunities existed, things like EBA workflows, which can be very manual and but at the same time very rote activities. As just one example there. And Ash sort of talked about sort of the vendor side of that.
Yeah, so we went into some of the automation of technical services and automatic shipment of core approval type books, as well as kind of value add services that vendors can bring to the table. Because as Doug mentioned, librarians are doing so many different things. There's a lot of kind of menial tasks that you can have your vendor basically outsource those and have books come in shelf ready or with mark records, and that saves time on staff's end to free them up to do local projects that vendors can't help with.
Okay, and just give us an idea. I mean, have you worked together before?
Yeah.
Yes, we've worked together for what, more than a decade now?
Yeah.
Really, since right when you started.
I
working
did. I
for
think Doug was like my second visit.
YDP.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. So
Okay.
we have been.
So you have long history working together,
We
and
do.
you've figured out how to mutually work out mutually beneficial projects.
Yes.
Yeah,
we don't always
absolutely.
agree on everything.
mainly when she's confused. But so, for example, when I was at Grand Valley State, we were early into DDA, and so working with Ashley, we were one of the first schools to pilot multi-vendor DDA with YUP at the time when they were starting to roll that out.
Yep.
So we've worked on different projects, and I think we have a pretty good working relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, as in part of the Voices article, Doug said, this environment cries out for increased reliance on automated approaches that leverage technology and third parties to assist with collection development. And when we talk about this environment, we mean the changes to digital environment, the changes away from a print environment, and so on. So what's the most important technology assistant vendors can provide to libraries? And I say this to both of you.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think we can blue sky this, or we can talk what's possible now.
Yeah,
with
let's
different
go
things.
now.
Let's go now.
Go
But
now.
let's talk about what we can do in the future going forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
You start, since that was actually your quote, and then I'll kind of go with because I'm like, I don't want to miss to say something you were thinking.
No, well, so we talked about EBA as one area there, where today we are creating these candidate pools from EBA through publishers, and frankly, creating them in a fairly rote and kind of, in my mind, rudimentary way where it's based on, well, the book was published in the last 3 years, it'll be in your EBA pool, or we use a subject collection that the publisher defines.
Let's define EBA.
Sure,
Yeah.
evidence-based acquisitions, where we commit a pool of dollars with a vendor, with a publisher, and based on that pool of dollars that we've committed, we will get access to usually a multiplied number of titles. So maybe you commit $25,000 and you'll get access to maybe $75,000 or $100,000 worth of books. At the end of usually a year period, you then get to have perpetual access to $25,000 worth of books. And so it's sort of a response to demand-driven, STL-based, short-term loan-based acquisitions.
And I think where a vendor like a monograph vendor could step in here and help with the management of that, where you're going outside of your normal monograph title by title or even some package purchase workflow, is what happens to the content that's not in that EBA. So if a publisher publishes X number of titles a year and you get 25% of them in your EBA, how are you finding the other 75%? What's happening to them? How do you deal with duplication and record management, and then the selection process on the back end, which I know we've talked about before. It's pretty cumbersome on your end. I mean, not super sophisticated in terms of, I'm sure you have lots of people looking at spreadsheets and trying to figure out which titles do you want to acquire at the end of an EBA. So we've just started working where like GOBI is supporting EBA, and so there is the record management on the front end and the back end. But even going forward, using something like an approval profile to say, instead of just these collections, we want it tailored to our university needs. And so we want this content based on the set of parameters in our EBA, and then the rest of the stuff, we either want to acquire an auto ship or look at the slips and firm order those slips. And so you're seeing the whole universe of the output of a publisher versus looking at it in two different pools and hoping you don't miss something.
Yeah, I think there's other things too. So I think that's a practical way that could be happening today, and I certainly think GOBI certainly go in that direction, provide some of those services. And I think as we move forward, if we think about all the data that we have in the cloud, so as many libraries go to Alma because there's really not a lot of choices in the marketplace, and so more and more libraries are going to Alma, and it lives in a cloud versus in the past when we had, pick the ILS. It was on a server on your campus, and that data was really kind of locked down. Are there ways that we can look at leveraging that data in a cloud-based environment to start to do predictive purchasing? And that could be based on what's happening in other similar schools. It could be based on what's happening within a consortium or at your local library. So if we have 5 holds on a book in my local campus library, I don't need a librarian or a staff to sit there and say, oh, we should buy a second copy of that book. Really what I want to have is somehow, through magic, all of a sudden GOBI just automatically, my ILS sends GOBI an order and that book just shows up. And that could be across a consortium as well, as we try to buy fewer copies of books across a consortium. Perhaps we say this book circulates this many times across the consortium, send a second copy, and then send that second copy randomly to one of the 15 schools in the consortium, leveling out the expenditures there, but making that another title available. There's no reason we can't do those types of predictive purchases going forward and automating things that, again, should be pretty simple there, things freeing up our librarians to do other things instead.
Yeah. And do you find that EBA is replacing DDA?
I think it's another flavor of it. It's for some schools, just like DDA for some schools, it works well, and for other schools, I think the monetary commitment to one publisher is a lot. That's my view on it.
Yeah. So I think, I would say it varies from school to school. So at Wisconsin, we've pretty much moved completely away from DDA. It does not work for us.
Do you still do STLs?
No, we don't do.
Okay.
We do no DDA. What happened is our usage is too intense. So we've got 15,000 graduate students. They use books a lot, along with a lot of faculty that are doing a lot of work as well. And so it's too expensive for us. Based on our usage, our candidate pools are so small using DDA, it just doesn't make fiscal sense. I was working with the one vendor last year that we ended. It was our last sort of DDA experiment. We'll try one more thing. And we had 6,000 titles in this pool. We were spending $50,000 to make 6,000 titles available. And on the one hand, it's great, the stuff's getting used, but I have to have a certain level of cost containment just to be able to make my budget work. And DDA doesn't do that. That's where, for us, evidence-based acquisitions works a lot better. We'd like to be able to do more, but it really needs to be a little bit more sophisticated than it is today. And that's where, again, I think using like an approval profile could make it a little more sophisticated, make it work for us just a little bit better. Because there we have that cost containment, we have the ownership pieces that we care about, and it makes a lot more sense for us. Whereas when I was at a smaller institution, we didn't do EBA because I don't think this many books are going to get used. I'm putting too much money with one publisher, and just didn't make a lot of sense for the way that primary undergraduate population worked.
So at Wisconsin, you're going to, you would like to attach your EBA to the approval profile?
Yes, I think that would be appealing, and I think, yes, and I think if we get really complicated, being able to get pool dollars with multiple publishers, I think that gets complicated or approaching impossible, the way that works. But in my happy place I live in sometimes, because I don't necessarily want to have all my eggs in one basket. It's easy for frankly, the Wileys of the world to say, I'm going to spend a lot of money on Wiley books. They're a big publisher, they're a big output. It's harder when you get down to Georgetown University Press.
Right.
But I still actually want access to that content, and how do I start to do that? Shifting slightly, you mentioned the move toward E and how this leads to automation. And some of these solutions we're talking about are around P, because unfortunately we're still heavily into P world, where I think it's 45% of the books that GOBI profiled last year did not have an electronic equivalent.
Correct. Somewhere right in there.
And so that number creeps up a little more each year.
Yeah.
But still, almost half the books that came out, and these are books we're acquiring, aren't available. In E, and so you see schools saying we're going E only. I'm like, well, so you've cut out half the world, you know. And you see schools going DDA only. Well, now you're down to
30% of the world.
30% of the world, so because that's just that small percentage that's available that way. So we're still in the state of transition, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I think again, you're at a big ARL university. What is it that YBP is going to do differently with Grand Valley, or a smaller university like that?
Yeah, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all model for every library. Even we were talking earlier today, even with ARLs, there's varying sizes and scopes of ARL libraries across the board. And in some cases, I think some comprehensive 4 years are bigger than some ARLs I work with in the way they function. So, as far as doing things differently, I think having the flexibility to tailor the suite of services that like a company like mine that I work for offers to different size libraries, whether it be pricing models or whether it be one school may need more, say for example, physical processing than another, and to be able to accommodate that. Approval plans themselves are flexible enough where you can either write a really large one or you can write a really small one. And so you're using the same toolkit, so to speak. It's just the way it's used is different between schools.
Yeah, the way you structure that up, where sometimes you'll have that, I always have, subscription to a large ebook aggregator, and that's my base layer. That's where I'm getting most of my ebook content,
Right.
and at my lowest cost per volume and my lowest cost per use, and they start layering on publisher packages I buy, start laying on top of EBA, maybe some DDA, where we stop. And the very tip is the smallest percentage of things I add to my collection each year are actually firm-ordered ebooks. In my institution, we're only adding a few hundred firm-ordered ebooks to our collection each year.
Really?
Because it's frankly the most expensive way to acquire that ebook content, and in some ways the most inefficient way as well. And so
if you're going with a triangle analogy, I think that triangle just looks different for different schools. Maybe not the base of it. That's probably very similar for most schools, just like the subscription piece you're talking about. But as far as the mix of how you're acquiring the rest of your monographs, whether it's auto ship approvals or an EBA DDA model or title by title, that can vary widely from school to school.
Yeah. Well, and I think, we have some librarians where I work who want to select books one by one.
Yeah.
And there are some departments that simply will not allow us to buy ebooks. Some humanities departments, they just said no ebooks. So, for us to automate that process is not easy.
Yeah.
I think that's where you start to do start making those books available, because there's this disbelief, especially in the humanities, that those books get used. But when you look at the big packages you have and you see what did get used, frankly, it's in the humanities. The ebook usage mirrors the print usage, where it's heavily driven by humanities and the social sciences and the STEM following things up. So
I've had these conversations.
yeah.
Well, and I think this is, it's interesting because where vendors can help most is in the electronic world if you want to reduce workload for the libraries. Libraries don't always want to reduce workload in that way, as in the selection of print books. And I think perhaps processing is one place that can really help with that. But approval plans in this environment with print books are probably the most, that's probably where we get most of our print books is through approval plans. And you've both mentioned approval plans as a part of this, of what, of how you can help, the vendors can help libraries be more efficient and free up time to do other things. And, it's an interesting issue because, last year, I think it was, at the Charleston conference, Rick Lugg and Bob Nardini made a presentation called Approval Plans and Apology. And they basically said, from the 80s through the present, we've filled libraries with all these books on approval plans, and now, we're going through and removing them and putting them in with shared print projects and so on, because good half of them never got used. And I guess it's a question for me and for many people. It does save time to select through approval plans, and it does save people's effort, but is it a good idea?
Yeah, well, I think approval plans still have a prominent place, and I think you would argue. So I think we talk about approval plans. Probably should be clear. I think often when libraries think approval plans, we're thinking auto ships.
Yes.
And I think on the vendor side, GOBI side, they have a much
They have
broader
many
definition.
more actions than just auto
so,
ships.
so do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
And then I can talk about what I
Sure.
think about
Yeah.
the role approval plans could play and should play today.
Yeah. So when I think of approval plans or approval profiles used interchangeably, I think of it as a rules-based plan with multiple outcomes.
Yeah.
So it can be a book for some schools. It can be a combo of book and notification slips in the case of like a traditional approval plan. Most smaller schools are notification slips only, where they're not getting automatic shipments, but yet those same approval profile rules are underpinning those weekly electronic notification slips. Other things the profiles do, they drive demand-driven programs. So what content is relevant for your library and your DDA pool versus just opening the floodgates and putting it in. So they allow like very good control and feeding of things like DDA and, as you said, like maybe potentially same thing for EBA, if we get to that point with using them. And so they do much more than just ship a book to a library.
But yeah, I would think when we think about sort of the auto shipment piece and that sort of struggle there, I think there's opportunities to do things differently. So we talked about using data to drive those pieces, and so you start to add in not just rules, but then data, either based on usage data for past things, or thinking about what's happening at other institutions that are similar to you. And so you start to see that going forward. And I think as libraries move forward, what I want it to be doing is less duplication, because I think we're buying too many of the same books, certainly in print. And instead thinking about how can we leverage approval plans across the consortium. For me, that might be across the Big Ten, or it could be across the University of Wisconsin system. And are there ways that we can use approval plans in that way to say, I want a copy of that book across the consortium, and let's spread that out. I think faculty would have a hard time, at least my institution, saying, we're not going to collect history books at Wisconsin anymore. We're actually going to let University of Minnesota collect all the history books, and we'll rely on them for access. But if you can set up an approval plan that would sort of spread that content out in a way that allowed for, frankly, less duplication, but more breadth and depth, and some geographic distribution of that content, I think that's really appealing. And if you layer on top of that electronic access, where everybody has access to the electronic content, and really all you're doing is that time you need the print for long form reading, that we can get our hands on that copy of that print for you. So I think that's a really the approach that I think really works for approval plans. At the same time, my institution, my undergraduate library, we just set up an approval plan, worked with Ashley to set up this approval plan for books that are reviewed in the New York Times, books that are reviewed in Times Literary Supplement, and books that are reviewed in New York Review of Books.
Yeah.
Our faculty expect us to have those books. They
Right.
show up in there, we should have them. We should not have a librarian sitting there going, oh, I see it was reviewed in the New York Review of Books.
Yeah.
Maybe we should buy that copy. That's just time that's not necessary. And so we can do that. Frankly, it's a low-cost proposition for us. Will all those books get used? No. That's a reality there. But there's a trade-off. There's a savings there, and down the road you hope you get more sophisticated models. But starting out from that, it's pretty straightforward, and that's an easy way to make some easy decisions. That I don't need librarians sitting there thinking about whether they want to do those things or not.
Right.
That works for me at Wisconsin, where I have a budget that's large enough to handle that. It may not work at a very small liberal arts college.
And it may not work in a place like Michigan where there isn't so much cooperation among the libraries.
Absolutely. So.
Well, and I think part of the question then is, if for instance, you assume Wisconsin doesn't study much history of Latin America or whatever, and Minnesota does, and so you wanted to have a cooperation in which the history of Latin America was heavily collected in one area but not in the other, I mean, that would be an approval plan that would be a workable way to cooperate without anybody feeling like they've lost something.
Yeah. So we certainly think about area studies, for example. We should be doing much more coordinated efforts around ensuring breadth and depth, and less about trying to focus on avoiding duplication there. So where we can sit there and take Latin America and say, well, collect El Salvador and Guatemala, you collect Honduras. And we know that we're at least developing breadth and depth and avoiding duplication, where if you look at something like the Library of Congress Cooperative Acquisitions Program, which essentially is an approval plan where Library of Congress is going out acquiring books for Library of Congress, and then sending them, but also acquiring additional copies they can send to libraries around the United States. In some ways that's great, but we're also getting copies of those same books. And there's an ease to that, there's something nice about that, but there's also this unnecessary duplication. We need some duplication of materials at the network level to assure 100 years from now we have access to those materials.
Right.
But we don't need the level of duplication that we have today, where again, my library since 2006, 75% of my collection is not circulated.
Yeah.
My circulation is down since 2006. I think it's 58%. My browsing's down even further. So people are coming to my library at the same rate or greater rate, but they're not using the facility and using those materials in the same way. At the same time, my ebook usage is actually skyrocketing. I don't think book usage is dropping as much as we think it is.
Yeah.
It's just changing from what it was. And
Yeah.
users are making a choice of the books here online right now, that meets my need, and I don't need to come into the library for that print copy. Even if I say my preference is to read a book in
Right.
print, I'm going to take that e-version.
Yeah, I
instead.
do think this is something we see, that people who prefer print in a survey use ebooks.
Yes. They're making an economic choice.
Yeah.
They're making a choice to say my time is more valuable and I'll take that time. My paper's due tomorrow. The grant application is due tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it in this way. And yes, long form reading is still important. We still need to make sure. I don't think print's going away completely.
No.
I just don't. But I think it's going to be really print is going to supplement the E, and the E will be the dominant format as we move forward. I don't see any way that's not happening.
And I would assume that vendors are able to accommodate a differentiated way to supply print books on approval that is not just auto ships, that it could be like PDA, print PDA, and so on.
Sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. Just like a notification slip of new electronic ebooks, or
if you want to have a sort of consortium-wide profile, I would assume you could differentiate between supplying ebooks and supplying print books to different institutions that have preferences.
yes, there would be a way to work with that. I don't know if I have anybody doing that particular type of setup that I know of, where they're getting auto shipments for P some places and E some places.
I think
you would have a shared E copy in the case of a consortia, and that is happening, where there are groups that buy an ebook a collection mostly in this case, and have everybody has access to it, and they're supplementing that with a print book, and that print book is going to different places or a centralized spot. So there's
Okay.
one print copy for the consortium, and then everybody has access to the E, kind of like what you were talking about with doing some kind of shared approval plan with them.
Yeah. So it's Research Triangle's
Yep,
doing that.
TRLN is, yes.
And we're having conversations about that in the Big Ten as well. Are there ways that we can look at and start to pilot acquiring a neat collection, and then instead of all of us buying a print copy, we're going to buy a print copy that we'll all then share, and that'll live at one library. And then when somebody needs that, we'll do that. And part of that's to see how much did we need to buy additional copies, or did we not?
Yeah.
And how does that meet users' needs and expectations?
It's a sort of preemptive shared print project.
It really is, because I think shared print is great, and we're involved in a lot of shared print programs on journal side and on the monograph side. So with HathiTrust, we've committed to 780,000 titles that we'll retain at Wisconsin as part of the HathiTrust shared print. And that's important, but we have to figure out how do we avoid the situation we got into where we needed shared print, where we stop buying so many copies of these books that aren't getting used, and let's buy more copies of other books, especially thinking about, we've spoken so much time on these mainstream publishers, which are important, but what about the marginalized voices? What about the alternative presses there? Who's collecting those things? And let's spend more time focusing on those things and think about going to automating these easier presses.
Right. Now that's actually a good idea, because we can all get our hands on Wiley books without any problem, but to get things from a little independent press, that's actually a more involved process.
Yeah,
So
especially when you think about print on demand, how that's made it easier, where for many of the major publishers, this stuff doesn't go out of print. I can theoretically always get my hands on those materials, where, again, an indie press, limited run, I may have missed my opportunity.
right. Getting some poetry or something like that just goes away fast.
Yeah.
How do you treat these, do you treat these little independent presses?
We do, so in a couple of different ways. So we have about 1,400 presses that we profile on the approval plan. A lot of them major, but a lot of them smaller. So, for example, like I call them SPDs, like special distributed presses, or the distributed art presses, where these smaller presses that get distributed by a bigger umbrella imprint. So we do handle those. In addition, we are always taking requests from libraries. So there's a whole nother smaller press list of things I call them, like, we trial them on approval, and then if we find they're viable and people are ordering, they'll move to kind of a permanent approval plan press. And so I get multiple requests a year from librarians, either for it's a regional press, they really want to be able to see, like, show me what's published by this press, I'm having a hard time keeping up with it and tracking it down, and it's just taking a lot of my time. Or it's a press that we don't have, and maybe I've just never been asked for it. And so we do take that feedback and give it to our buyers, and on a regular basis add presses to the approval plan, kind of like trial list, and then see what happens with them. So we track them. We also have a lot of content, as I'm sure most other monograph vendors do, in the database we don't handle on approval. So they're presses that for some reason or another, either they're outside the scope of how we define an approval plan press list, or their terms aren't favorable to work with for auto shipments. For the libraries that do have auto ships, they do have to kind of fit a certain criteria, but their content is still fed and put in the database. So you can still search for it and set it up to kind of run a regular search and see what's new from that publisher. So there's ways to discover it outside of just the approval plan.
But certainly the super teeny small presses, as you start doing niche collecting, becomes really challenging. So it's not books, but on the sort of journal side, we have a very strong literary magazine collection. It's small, it's avant-garde, it is alternative, and we spend massive amounts of time tracking down single issues of magazines for this collection.
Yeah.
And same thing we think about, you mentioned poetry, some of our poetry collections as well, where we're working really hard to get our hands on some of these things, just to identify them, and once you identify them, get your hands on those titles. It's really hard.
And so much the better to have the time to deal with that, and not to
Yes.
just choose Wiley books that are very easy to get
Yes.
hold of
Yeah.
anyway.
Not to pick on Wiley.
Yeah,
So,
no, we could say someone else, but
pick on Springer. But yeah, no, exactly. There's some things that should just be easy. Let's make those as easy as possible, and knowing that for some things will be hard. Because also the reality is, for the majority of libraries, they're actually not trying to build collections like that. I think every library we know has unique and distinct things in them, but it may not be necessarily their mission to sort of build a collection like that. But I think that's where I think about automation solutions to help them out.
Do you think that between EBA and DDA, there's going to be a dominant approach in the coming years?
I don't. I think it's going to be a mixed bag. And I think it goes back to it doesn't work for every library idea. There will be some that adopt both or a combo of both. There will be others where, and I even know from talking to libraries now where they've tried EBA and they just didn't have enough use, or the mass wasn't there to support an ongoing EBA program. And on the flip side, your example with demand-driven doesn't work at every library just because it can be too expensive at some, or it ends up being not enough content for what you're paying for it.
Yeah, I think we're still figuring things out. I think, especially on DDA, I think one of the things we figured out, the publishers figured this out very early, was that it was not financially viable for the publishers. And I think that's something, there's always that tension that exists between, I'm trying to get the best value to make as much content available as the lowest price. And we've got a lot of publishers, especially on the university press sides. We can pick on the big STEM publishers that make lots of money, but on the university press side, that they've got to make their money back, and they've got to it has to be a viable model. And I think as DDA's gotten more and more expensive, and I'm not sure if you know what the average percentage of an STL is, but we got to be what, 30-40%?
25, 40 for the UP press area. 20-ish for trade. Kind of, it averages out to about 25 when you look at numbers.
Yeah, you think about those days when you used to be able to do when it was 10%, you would say buy the fifth use because that's the most cost-effective thing. Because I've only spent 40% of the price of the book, and at that point it's going to get used a lot. Those days are gone where you can't do that anymore. And while some ways it stinks, on the other hand, it makes sense. Again, they're not can't just give away their stuff.
Well, I mean, the people who are publishing, if they can't survive, we can't get short-term loans from them.
Exactly. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see, are we still sort of in this sort of Wild West era where the market's still evolving? Or are we going to reach some sort of equilibrium where now we understand these models are stable and will continue on? I'm still not convinced that we've figured that out yet. We still might be trying to figure out, will DDA survive, or will it continue to go up in price in a certain way? Because there's more and more books are buying first use, right?
First use or embargoed. I don't know the stats off the buy and first use off the top of my head, but there are quite a few publishers where it's either buy and first use or buy and first use for a year, and then the short-term loans start, where they've either embargoed their short-term loans or they've embargoed their content from going into a pool altogether. So it gets really confusing the longer it's in the marketplace and the more changes that happen to kind of keep up with who's doing what.
It's going to get to the point where it's so little, it's not an advantage anymore, so the model will go away.
That, or personally, I think it's a great backlist model for content. So if you're buying your front list content either via approvals or some type of collections, but then say after a couple years, let's put it in a DDA pool. If it gets short-term loan or used then, fantastic. But the publishers aren't having to depend on that front list content just sitting in somebody's DDA pool, because it takes so long for a title to be found in there sometimes.
And getting paid for something in their old catalog is fine.
Yes, it's wonderful, probably.
I mean, it's interesting as well as we think about, we talked about the percentage of books that are still not available in E, and I think what we have to figure out is what are those market solutions that get us closer to that point, or to that point where publishers are comfortable putting out all or most of their catalog in an E format. That, because I think from the library standpoint, that's what we want. I want to be able to make everything available in E, and so much of it's just not available. And I think for university presses, of course, it's the course adoption issue. Are there ways that we can figure out models that help university presses be financially viable, that also allows us to meet our mission, which is providing both research but also instructional materials for our students. And,
especially with a lot more programs going online. This is something that is going to have to be dealt with humanities faculty who hate ebooks.
Yes.
If you've got a bachelor's degree in English online, and every book in your collection is a print book, and those kids are all over the world, students, there's going to be a problem.
Well, I think even on big campuses, I mean, I'm sure both our campuses, we've got programs where in the humanities where you've got hundreds of students taking those courses, and you've got one copy of that print book on reserve, and which is like great, and certainly it helps students, and if it's on reserve, they can check it out for 2 hours at a time. It helps students. We can all point to the stories of students have been helped by that, which is fantastic. But it doesn't scale.
Yeah.
It doesn't scale in that way. And all the students that could be helped aren't going to be helped in that way. And so that's where ebooks can come in. But again, we have to figure out what that model is and how do we find that sort of middle ground that makes it viable for the process.
Because we can't buy two of everything either.
No, it doesn't make sense. Although it seems like in the past, my university, they were buying two of everything. Those are the ones that aren't getting used. So.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, I think part of this question is what's going to happen with, you think of, was it Arizona State, University of Maryland, Southern New Hampshire University? I'm sure they're not building huge print collections to support their online programs. And that's going to be a growth for a lot of universities. So again, the question of whether we buy print books or ebooks may not simply and only reside in the preferences of certain people.
Yeah, you're right.
And I don't know where this is going to come down to you, not to people like me in the middle management, but this is going to be more, you're going to have to be the bad guy.
Great.
Yeah. So, I think it's interesting to think about, to just make a transition to a sort of history question. You say, Ashley, in the Voices article, libraries of today look very different from libraries 15 years ago. And what would you say are the most significant changes you've seen in your time working in libraries, and how did those changes affect your job and the structure of the company you work in?
Yeah, probably the biggest shift is PDE. So when I started, I had
which is print to electronic.
Print-based approval plans. There were no ebooks in them. I was selling collections of things, so think like Springer packages, or at the time Academic Complete was one of those collections or subscriptions we had. And so when you're working with libraries, you're solely talking print. What print books you want in the library, what print slips do you want, and the e-output was so little at that time, and most of the ebooks were so far behind the print that at that point nobody was looking at new ebook content. It was about 3 years into my role as a rep.
When did you start?
2008.
Okay.
So about 3 years into that, we integrated e-approval plans, 2 or 3, somewhere in there. And so you had the option of getting an ebook or a print book, and that was a big shift, and I can remember thinking, like, how am I supposed to think about this? And again, at the time, I think 7% of the output was coming out at the same time. So what do you do with all the old stuff? So you have this other kind of plan to catch it, which is kind of moot today because everything comes out about the same time. And so there's been this really interesting shift over the years of going from all print approval plans and writing print approval plans to majority of profiles having some e-preferred component, whether it be within LC classes or within certain formats or publishers. And then add in DDA to the mix, and now EBA to the mix. You've got all these different things happening, and there's a big learning curve on the vendor side, but I think also on the librarian side of like, you have 27 models that we're working with. What order do you want these in? And what do you prefer? And probably the biggest challenge has been articulating like how it works and what the cascade means and the preference of titles and what version do you want? Do you want DDA or do you want e-preferred? And so having to fit in that e-preferred workflow with the print, and it's not apples to apples, but how can you keep it as similar as possible, because it's a lot of times the same person doing the ordering for monograph acquisitions, whether they're E or P. And so that for me has been the biggest change in the market. That, and then in addition to that, I would say the acquiring and consolidation of companies. So I've been through two different, we bought Blackwell 3 years into the mix when I was a rep, and setting up 75 new libraries with approval. I got really good at approval plans that year. Met lots of new people and got lots of new libraries to work with. And then the being purchased by EBSCO and the changes, and they haven't been as drastic as like acquiring a company, to be honest. That was a bigger difference than being acquired, mostly because there wasn't that huge influx of library accounts. But going through two different transitions over the 11 or so years that I've been doing this job. Oh yeah, those would be
And
the
I
big
think
changes.
for a lot of us, this whole question of, like back in 2011, we started buying ebooks, and so we set up a DDA program and started acquiring them. But then the question of who wants them, who doesn't, how do you differentiate them, when are the ebooks available versus the print books? So there was a question. They'd say, yeah, we're going to print it, and we're going to give you the print copy first, and then if you want the ebook copy, maybe it'll be published later. So either you get it, but 6 months later, get the ebook 6 months later, and then you're not happy with that because the book is 6 months older. So now that they're all published at the same time, it's not as big a deal.
Yeah.
But I think the maturity in that is welcome. You were one of the first people who was really into PDA back in the day.
Yes, indeed.
Was this something you guys cooked up?
You started it before.
So we started working with EBL, and boy, that would have been, I don't even know when it was. We started working with EBL, 2007, 2008 probably.
Wow.
I think we started working with EBL, and started doing that with DDA with them, and you start to realize how much you're missing out on. We were working with one vendor in that time, and so trying to think how it came about that we started doing the pilot with YBP for the multi-vendor PDA, but
Was that 2012?
might have been a little before that, yeah. So either way, we were having conversations. I'm sure it was probably because you were trying to get me to flip over to send that spin, because essentially we took money from, we were spending with YBP, we're going to spend it with EBL. But when we got going at the time, so Grand Valley, it's a 4-year comprehensive master's university. At that time, it had about 20,000 students. And we were running one of the largest PDA programs in the country. Certainly through YUP, it was one of the largest numbers, because it was essentially wide open, because we could afford it wide open. It was like, here's the budget we're going to put toward this, turn it on and see what happens. And it ran wide open, and it worked really well for us. Thankfully, by the time I left was about the time the publisher started raising prices, so I didn't have to deal with all those problems. And what do you do now? My successors were like, "What were you doing?" I was like, "It made sense at the time." So
Call away in Wisconsin.
so screen my call. So that's Grand Valley again. So no, but I mean, at the time it made sense because it fit in our budget. We could do these things where we could buy, a $1,000 encyclopedia, make those things available, because there was really. It fit in the budget, we can make it work, and it made fiscal sense. I spent 10% on a $1,000 encyclopedia. If I never bought it, great, because that one time student needed something that worked okay.
So yeah, you at Grand Valley kind of were the testing ground for a lot of this with PDA, and I think the fact that we're kind of moving. I mean, I now look at PDA as being almost untenable. I don't do EBA because I don't think we're going to get it. I don't want to spend that money. I don't want to commit to that money because I don't think we're going to get enough. And so we're all kind of thinking, okay, I don't want to buy more than I need, but I can't just not buy things because the faculty need the things for their research. And there's a degree to which we're still just thinking, okay, we've got to just buy them and hope they're useful. And we can't just have people request a book and buy it.
Yeah, and I think what you're trying to do is figure out in the market what are that sort of pyramid of solutions that brings you the best value. Because again, buying a book ebooks one by one, it's really expensive.
Yes.
I mean, you're often, especially, so for at my institution, our preferences are for unlimited users and DRM free. So we're often going publisher direct, as you would describe, the spendiest way to acquire those books. But when I always like to use sort of the Costco analogy. So I've got 3 kids. I go to Costco, I buy the giant thing of toilet paper. I get that toilet paper on a per roll cost much lower than if I go to the grocery store and buy the 4-pack. Same thing with ebooks, where we're buying in bulk. And so figure out whether that solution of buying in bulk, whether it's a subscription, whether it's EBA or a publisher package, what makes sense for me and my users. Because I think if you look at the big subscription packages, what you see in general is the percentage that gets used very much aligns with your print collection, with your print usage there. But I can use some of my big STEM publisher packages where 40% of those packages get used.
Really?
And so in a given year, I'll see 30 to 40% of those packages get used. So that tells me I'm getting great value. My unit cost is low, and that return on that investment, which we hate in libraries, but I have this fiscal responsibility to the organization I work for, is really high. So, but again, what solution works for me wouldn't work, especially at Wisconsin, did not work at Grand Valley. I said no on those things. I think they're still saying those types of things because it doesn't make sense for them to spend, tens or hundreds of $1,000s on ebook packages that likely a high percentage of won't get used.
I mean, when I look at ebook package usage at CMU, maybe 20% of the package is getting 80% of the use. And so the rest of it is just, we can get it through ILL or something, and so just buy 10 books and forget the rest of it. But that's, so that's why EBA doesn't work, because most of it is, we'd have to commit to buying all this stuff that is not getting used. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting, because I was going to ask you, like between Grand Valley and Wisconsin, you've got huge ARL and a sort of regional, very active and very progressive regional university. So what would you say is what is the biggest advantage for a smaller university, maybe even smaller than Grand Valley, like a little university with a few thousand students? What's the advantage to them to go to more mediated work through the vendors?
That's a good question. I don't know if he asked you or me that.
You can both answer.
Well, so for me, when I look at schools in the University of Wisconsin system, very small. So I mean, Madison is a behemoth compared to a lot of schools where they just frankly have just a handful of librarians and they're wearing lots of different hats. And so, and if you think about that return on investment, whether that is ordering books, processing books, and getting those, handling, doing copy cataloging or original cataloging, or going out there and doing instruction to a class of students and consulting with a faculty member that's working on a research project. What has the bigger, again, return on investment? I would argue that it's far more important to do that one-on-one work or that instruction work with students than to stamp the books and make sure that barcode's on the right, on the back right corner and blah blah blah.
And that's where I find a vendor comes in helpful, because it's super interesting if you're ever to come and watch book processing at the home office. I mean, it's like down to a science at this point, and it's not a super expensive thing to outsource. It may seem like a lot when you hear $2 a book or whatever odd number based on the services you opt for, but then calculate the time you're paying a staff member to do that same project. Or I do hear a lot of times, like, our students do that, which is, they did it at the school I worked at before GOBI, but the idea of what are those things those efficiencies you can have a vendor help with, so that when you get a book into the library, you've already got a record ready, and you may need to do a little work to it, but you're not going in, finding it, having to add everything to it for local practices. All that's done. Your EDI invoicing, you bring in an invoice, you don't have to key in an invoice. That's free.
When you think about that too, so I've talked to lots of libraries that use Amazon as their primary thing, and certainly EBSCO's and that, I could talk about all the things that EBSCO does, but we won't talk about that. No. But, Amazon's just as big of a company, just way bigger.
Way bigger.
But I think libraries say, well, I saved $2 on that book, or I saved $5 on that book, but then all the time that goes into that, where I'm doing one invoice, one invoice, one invoice, one invoice.
Who do you call if you have a problem? I don't know.
But yeah,
Yeah.
but
I mean,
that-
like,
but-
and then you
but
run in-
save time.
You do, well-
But while you're working with you, you're saving time.
Yes,
and
sorry, I
that
think
time is not money. So you have to figure out
Yeah.
what pot you're doing those things
Yeah.
out of. And so we've been doing a lot. We do a lot of things with used book ordering. We've been using Amazon primarily for our used book out of print marketplace, and it's really on the back end because you're dealing with credit card payments. It's really expensive. And so we're actually looking for a vendor solution for that problem, because I'm sure people watch this and they'll start calling. But yeah, but we're looking for a vendor solution to that problem
Yeah.
because we think there's more efficient ways. Let a vendor handle those pieces and track down those books for us. And we think they could probably do it, frankly, in a more efficient way than we can do it. And then we can free up our acquisition staff to do a lot of other things.
Yeah, and that really is kind of the question I wanted to wind up with here, is that, this is a place where it is clearly better to outsource what you're doing to a vendor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this is true if you're a little library or a big library, and especially with something like used books.
Yeah.
So where do you guys see the most value for libraries and vendors to work together?
For me, I think it is having like one place to do all this. So your staff that's placing orders isn't going out to 5 different plus places to place an order, 5 different workflows on receiving an order and invoicing. And so having, I hate the word one-stop shop, but kind of having that like one centralized place to discover, find things. The other, I'm trying to remember the question you said as I say this. I think the other big efficiency is, Doug mentioned it earlier, like those core kind of no-brainer materials. Those are the things a good, in this case, monograph vendor can help you bring in. That way your librarians aren't spending time going through and picking out those, couple $1,000s worth of core books they're going to pick anyway. Mm-hmm. That way you get those in automatically. They come in shelf ready with all the records. And you save time on 2 ends, your librarians in and your acquisition staff in.
Yeah, I'd say all those things. I think another piece that happens is, so Ashley or Claire, who works for Ashley, who works with my library, you see a lot more libraries than I see.
Yeah.
And so often we only know what we do. We don't know whether we do it well or not, but this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a especially on the book side, I think it's a little bit different, maybe on the journal side as well, on the serial vendor side. There's a consultation benefit to libraries as well, where you're having somebody that says, so I will sit down and with my rep and say, where do you see gaps for what we're doing? Certainly it's a sales opportunity on that side, but and I may not buy stuff, but but what are those things that people are doing that we're not doing? What should I at least be thinking about in that way? And then certainly I'm a couple steps away from this. I'm generally not dealing with the book rep when they come in each time. I may only see them a couple times a year,
Right.
and so sort of pop in. Sometimes it's hey, but other times it is, what are those opportunities? And because they see so many other libraries similar to my library, they can say, well, here's things that are happening, or here's what's happening at this institution. And when you have that great relationship with them, you understand that this is this may or may not result in a sale for you. Mm-hmm. Odds are it won't, because we're broke. But but at least we're understanding. A little more perspective there
Right.
From their end, because I think you often see libraries. You know what the good libraries are. You know the libraries where there are opportunities.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yes.
And if you don't know those things that you're not doing, just like you said, then you never know you could do them. So what happens when you have a retirement or somebody leaves and you can't rehire that position, and maybe they were doing some of those tasks you talked about 6 months ago? Mm-hmm. Is that a good time to say, why don't we try this instead, because we're not going to fill that, or that position is going to get filled in a different way than it used to be?
Yeah.
And that's when, an example, physical processing usually gets outsourced to a vendor, is when there's a retirement. Instead of using that line to hire somebody to process books again, you need them to do something else.
Yeah.
Not a menial task.
Yeah.
The value of cooperation.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.